G'day, my name's Andrew Lee, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this conversation with Labor MP Jon Cruddas. Jon has been the member for Dagenham and Rainham since 2001, winning it in the landslide vote of 293 votes in the 2019 election. As the red wall crumbled, Jon managed to hold his constituency. He has just written a fascinating book called The Dignity of Labor, which is about the British Labor Party, the party that Jon loves, but also to some extent about the Australian Labor Party and about social democratic parties all around the world. Jon is a great public intellectual, somebody who I've met in the UK, but somebody who has also spent time in Australia. And indeed, that might have been where he got his political start. Jon, welcome to the conversation.
Andrew, it's great to see you again. And thanks for the opportunity to kick these things around, because they are generic issues that span progressive politics across Western market economies, so it's good to have a conversation about them.
Absolutely. So is it true that you got your political blooding on construction sites in Australia?
That is true. Actually, I do reference it in the book. A lot of my family left, a lot of cousins are across Australia. They left in the early 70s, actually. And I went over, worked on the construction sites. This would have been 1980, 81. And the first thing I did before I could work, I had to go and get my Builders Labourers Federation card. There's a pre-entry closed shop, as we'd call it then. Came back. This was before, I should add, some of the deregistration issues with the Labourers Union. But I got a pretty salty education out of that. I can assure you. It was quite a steep learning curve I was on, but it was some of the best education I've had in the labour movement, actually.
And you then worked for Tony Blair for a while. You were one of his liaison people with the trade union movement.
Yeah. Basically, what happened? I came back. I went to college then when I came back to the UK, and moved around a bit. Went to America, came back, and then rather than going to the academia, there was a job in the research department of the party. This was in the days of opposition in the early 1990s, and I got to know Tony Blair, who was our shadow employment spokesman. I was dealing with the union links, labour law, individual and collective rights. And then when we won in 97, I was fortunate enough to go in, and my job in Downing Street for Blair was around introducing the minimum wage, rights at work. It was a fantastic period. And then 2001, I got elected for Dagenham in East London, and I've been there ever since. We've had a few boundary changes. But yeah, it's been quite a we're in a pretty bad state of affairs at the moment. We've lost 4 elections in 11 years, and we had some rough elections just last week. So it's been a bit of a high wire act throughout, really, but we're not in a good place at the moment.
No, and that's true of social democratic parties around the world. I mean, the French socialists are nowhere to be seen. Italy, the left seems to be in terrible strife. It looks as though in Germany, the SPD is trailing the Greens. And in the United States, Biden got over the line, but with Trump picking up millions more votes than he had beforehand. So we'll get in a moment to some of the big challenges of the left. But I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about the local context, because one of the things I love about the way in which you think is that so much is grounded in history and grounded in place. You say that work and Dagenham are synonymous. Tell us about that.
Well, this is our 100th year. Dagenham really was created in 1921. I'm doing a project now about the history. It's our centenary. But in one sense, Dagenham tracks the dynamics of the 100 years of British capitalism, because Dagenham is synonymous with Ford. It was Ford Dagenham plant was opened in 1931. And at the time, it was the first part of the first multinational, actually. It was a real pioneering place, huge battles both in North America, Dearborn, as well as in Dagenham for union recognition. And then in one sense, Dagenham was showcased post-war as the height of working class virtue in terms of stability as a community. But then we witnessed Thatcherism, deindustrialization. There used to be 43,000 workers on the Dagenham plant. Now there would barely be 1,500 directly employed. We witnessed deindustrialization, the right to buy. It was the biggest council estate in the world in terms of public housing. It was created to clear the slums of inner East London. Lloyd George talked about building homes for heroes. And Dagenham was synonymous with that, the dignity of the working class through some clearance and automotive manufacturing. And so it's been a really bumpy ride, really, the last few years. But now we're literally rebuilding Dagenham again through new film studios, relocating universities. We're trying to transition the Ford Motor Company into electric vehicles beyond the combustion engine. We're building the markets of London into Dagenham. It's relocating thousands of decent, well-paid jobs. So actually, made in Dagenham is being sort of is a term we're using again. Whereas when I first started, it looked like our best days were behind us. Now there's a really interesting period ahead, partly driven by innovative Labour local government, civic leadership, which is, compared to our national plight, we could learn from what we're doing at local level.
And politically, you've seen some pretty strong forces moving against Labour in Dagenham. You describe it in the book as being the top Tory target seat in London. You had a 70% leave vote in the Brexit referendum. The British National Party has targeted Dagenham. Why is it that Labor has struggled in a place like yours?
Well, it is. I mean, it's often used as a similar community to Youngstown, Ohio, to signal what was happening with Trump and the Rust Belt going to the sort of populist right. We had 2006 to 10, we had 12 British National Party councillors on our local council, local civic administration. It was the front line in an epic fight across the whole country against the fascist right in 2010 to 2014. We successfully beat them, and by beating them, we destroyed them actually nationally as a global force. But we sort of arguably hit a red wall 10 years before it was quite a popular term. You know, Dagenham was the fastest changing community in Britain. The reality was it was growing and changing dramatically. But, and I'm sad to say, Labour was in government. We took it for granted a bit as one of our traditional heartlands. We were preoccupied with the bellwether marginal seats in what we call Middle England, and there was a sense that the working class had nowhere else to go, and they fractured off and started supporting different forms of far-right populist movement. This was sort of showcased in a Brexit vote in the referendum at 2016. As you say, we had 70% leave vote. For the last 11 years, we've been a pretty marginal seat. We've managed to hold on. We're quite well organised. Just the last election, we were scheduled to lose by about 5,000, but we hung on. But it has been difficult. And that's why I sort of use it as a sort of portal into some of these wider debates shaping progressive politics and the rise of authoritarian populism, because this is sort of feeds on the back of a disgruntled working class sentiment. Let me give you an example. There was a poll out in the UK just last week which said that amongst social classes C to D, E, the traditional working class, Labour's 36 points behind. 36 points behind. Now that's my constituent. That's, you know, that is what we would always assume to be the traditional base of the left, is sort of, as you'd say, gone walkabout a bit. And how do we rethink what that is all about? So I sort of used Dagenham to try and showcase a series of arguments. And the book is trying to make an argument, because what's happening in Labour, I don't know, there must be an equivalent debate in the ALP. It's almost the party is changing by stealth, and we're not really having a debate about it. It's changing, and people are quite aggressive now, saying that the working class has gone as our base, and there is a new progressive coalition out there, which we should inhabit as our own new base, without even discussing the terms of this transition. So that's why I sort of make an argument to say, be careful what you wish for here, because I don't see there's a winning coalition on this new sort of picture that's presented. And it goes against what the party was actually created to be and who it's for. So I simply try and make an argument to try and jump into this debate and try and say, well, let's contest this, because it seems to me there's a train left the station in terms of the British Labour Party, and we need to sort of really think through the consequences of some of these moves. Sorry, there's a building truck just outside my flat now. So.
Not at all. We've got work going on. This is terrific. But a lot of what you talk about seems to be brought out in Tom Piketty's new bestseller, Capital and Ideology, where he documents that right across a whole lot of advanced countries, there's been this shift of parties to the left from being parties that predominantly represented lower educated voters to parties that represented higher educated voters. I was just looking at Piketty again before our conversation today. He says in the 1950s, British Labour was 30 points behind among the highest educated voters. Now British Labour is 10 percentage points ahead among the highest educated voters. So, and that, much the same is true of Germany, France, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. But somebody who took an alternative view of yours, and I guess I should play devil's advocate, would say, well, education levels are going up. So doesn't it make sense for parties of the left to chase a growing constituency in higher educated voters?
Absolutely. And that is one of the arguments. I mean, it almost gets to the degree that people are suggesting in every defeat there's a victory, and there's a sort of demographic determinism to this, in the sense that if we can just hold the line, we can transition from these old heartlands to these new heartlands, and we have age, culture, knowledge work all on our side. So there's a sense of technological inevitability alongside demographic transition, and older people are dying, newer people will be around for longer. So what's there not to like? Well, I would question, firstly, whether there is a coalition outside of certain university towns and certain urban environments to sustain a Labour victory anytime soon. So even on the own terms of the political optics, it's questionable to me. But there's a deeper question around political parties are built around traditions of justice. They are informed by public philosophies around who they are there to represent. A sense of economic transformation on behalf of working people has always informed the Labour tradition. And I just simply make an argument that we should be careful what we jettison without even thoroughly debating it. Not just on electoral terms, because I don't think there's a coalition there to win, but also on ethical terms around the Labour. Let me give you an example. The Labour Party now is 75% of our membership comes from social classes ABC 1. I think we had 2 million more voters from social classes ABC 1 compared to social classes C2DE, the working class versus the middle classes. The seats where we're winning are increasingly middle class ones, and we're losing across what we euphemistically call this red wall. And there is a fundamental change occurring. Brexit was a symptom of this. It wasn't a cause of it. These are long-term. We've been debating this for 20 years. But now it's sort of propelling forward this argument. So we might almost be in a situation where in a year or two, the Labour Party has fundamentally changed. And some are arguing even now that we should rechristen it as the Radical Liberal Party or the Progressive Party or even a Young People's Party to match these demographic changes. You're right. Piketty calls it the Brahmin left, that sense of liberal, educated, progressive coalition that are dominating now. My question is this inevitable, or does this signal a failure of social democratic parties to renew themselves? So it's a symptom of decay rather than a future advancement. And I would suggest it is. I'm quite taken by a series of arguments put forward by Michael Sandel, who's argued that post-war social democracy lost its ethical character, its desire to regulate and civilize capital, and became static, managerial, technocratic under the Blair, Clinton, Schroeder era, and so accepted too much of the neoliberal compact ushered in by Reagan and Thatcher, and it has not successfully renewed. So it hasn't got the ethical or the moral resources to deal with the issues that surround us today. And we have to rediscover an ethical energy in terms of our desire to regulate the market and confront capital. And we do that by re-establishing a politics of work. I say that emphasis on work because one of the key components of the debate in the UK, I'd be very interested to know if it's the same in Australia, is a lot of the more fashionable left in the UK that are arguing for this radical transition also say that Labour should be the post-work party, right? It should celebrate a world where the robots are coming, the fourth industrial revolution is inevitable, that work is inherently degrading. So we should foresee a future of liberty and abundance driven by technological change as we move to an era described as post-capitalism. And this will happen naturally as we transition through the gears of late capitalism. I think that's more a case of left futurology rather than strategic insight. And I'm weary of that sort of thesis because I think it's a sort of almost magical thinking of the type which could end the party for good. So these are
let's come
issues.
To that in just a moment. And I'm very keen to dive into your views on universal basic income as well. But just flesh out for me a little bit more about what a politics of work looks like. You've got your good work covenant. What sort of issues would a work-focused Labor Party be talking about?
Well, I go into quite a bit of detail. I mean, some of it is around, well, a lot of it is around the modern degradations of work that we see all around us. This is obviously the gig economy is centre stage in a lot of that, but we have delivery drivers running around averaging £2 an hour through the course of their shift, while their chief executive is making 500 million when floating the shares. You know, we've just had 500 British gas workers laid off because under the guise of the pandemic and COVID, they're firing them and then rehiring them. There's this fire and rehire practice that's going on everywhere across the UK at the moment, where people are just getting re-employed on worse employment conditions. We've had the Supreme Court of this country just recently say that some of the employment practices in companies like Uber are inherently unjust. This is the Supreme Court of the country and saying that politicians have a moral obligation to rectify some of these modern degradations in work. So there is a sense that these are not, the notion of a politics of work is not an anachronistic, nostalgic notion. It's highly contemporary in terms of the modern dispossessions inherent in our economic systems. Also, I would argue that a lot of the problems with Labour over the last 20 years is that it's neglected a politics of work. It's become too obsessed with certain trajectories and technological assumptions around the working class disappearing through automation. This is also not just on the Corbyn left over here, but it was also a hallmark of the Blair left, actually. So we tend to invest too much on the inevitability of technological change rather than seeing this as political choices that confront us as political parties. So what I try and do is just to say there's nothing inevitable here. There's nothing deterministic, both in terms of technology or demography. And we should actually think about where we can intervene to humanize work, to create good work, to use labor individually and collectively, labor law, so that we can re-regulate certain employment abuses, that we rethink about how we reward and value work. Obviously, within the pandemic, the dignity of the work, the carers, the delivery drivers, the transport workers has been center stage. My constituency has been situated in what's been called the center of the COVID triangle. It was the highest in the second wave in the country because people were working. They were having to work to care, they were key public servants. And the interesting thing for me has always been the jobs that involve the most care for each other are those that are rewarded least. And what does that say in terms of a comparative index of what we prioritize in our societies compared to high finance or the city or whatever? So I try and go into some of these questions of value and reward in terms of work, rebuilding our vocations. our callings in terms of those work professions that need to be honoured and rewarded and respected and supported through training, education, employment protections, whether they are key public servants should have a priority in terms of access to key public services, in terms of valuing the work they do. There's a whole host of things. I go back into a thing that we've never really embraced in the UK, forms of industrial democracy that are widely prevalent across mainland Europe in terms of worker directors and trying to democratise work. So there's a whole sort of, there's a whole menu of policies.
Yeah, what's really interesting to me is you don't just spend time talking about the way in which work could be better. You also remind us that most people enjoy their job. You say that 79% of workers say they find their work interesting, and that its work isn't merely a source of income, and that there's something very different to getting 80,000 a year from a job as distinct from getting 80,000 a year from the government. Tell us now about your views on universal basic income. I remember one Briton I was talking to once describing it as being turbo welfareism. What do you think about it?
Well, I can see very good arguments for it and very good arguments against it. I mean, I think it is over here. It was seen as a solution to automation before the pandemic, and then it was seen as a solution to the pandemic. It's seen as a sort of magic bullet to all sorts of contemporary challenges. And I say that, okay, let's unpack this a bit and go through what we're trying to achieve, what assumptions inform the different arguments in favour. So, for example, if I was I don't support the universal basic income advocated by Milton Friedman or Charles Murray, right? But they would embrace forms of universal income. I'd also don't embrace the universal basic income of a lot of the tech pioneers who see it as sort of offsetting their own culpability for structural unemployment. You know, it's a sort of get out of jail card for them.
Except they're not even willing to pay taxes, right? I mean,
well,
if you're not going to pay the taxes, it seems a bit rich to be advocating the world's biggest spending program.
Absolutely. And there's a bigger debate there about their own responsibilities in terms of contribution, in terms of modern. And that's why some of the Biden arguments about global tax justice are really interesting that are coming to the fore now. Right. But as an aside, going back to the UBI, I can see arguments for it. I want a more humane social security system. Does that mean, is that universal basic income? I wouldn't suggest it is. But the usual argument that is used in the UK, it is because of this same technological inevitability about the end of work. Now, if work was ending, there would be a strong case for UBI. But I see work as an inherently political terrain that can be shaped by politics rather than its inevitability to be degraded and declining. And I see it, the way it's been used in a lot of the left debates, as just a sort of I give up policy, right? And just walking off the park about contesting the dignity of labour. And it's for arguments around the dignity of labour that I think we should be very cautious about seeing it as a panacea. And instead, we should get our hands dirty with the more difficult task of, rather than maximising welfare, just saying we're going to build dignified work, even argue that it should be almost a constitutional right for every citizen to have decent work. Because I follow the sort of Hannah Arendt argument that work is key to our sense of purpose and who we are as human beings. And the really interesting thing, if you see a lot of the debate around work, it's all about its degradation, about how it offers nothing. But actually, if you look through all the data, work still is an incredibly key ingredient in terms of what we value and what we cherish, what we desire. And there's a large majority who still extract all of that from the work they do. So there's a danger in having one sort of certain sectors of the economy. We are reading too much in terms of how we're understanding the whole of the economy in terms of people's work and what they get from it. And I think there's a danger in politics that we just play on one part of the pitch, you know, and we lose our wider perspective. And so we need to, without doubt, have a much tougher menu of remedies in terms of some of the modern degradations of work, but also acknowledge its vital ingredient to who we are and the lives we wish to live, and how we want to live rewarding lives, of which contribution and work are vital elements in terms of a life well lived.
So if you look at what the Blair government did with reference to your focus on work, they introduced the national minimum wage. They ramped up tax credits for in-work tax credits, making work pay, as Clinton put it a couple of years earlier, up to nearly 2% of GDP. So, pretty substantial in-work tax credit. But you have a critique of Blair where you say that he moved from giving ethically grounded speeches, you say much in the tradition of a sort of Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, also to some extent Bush and Obama, towards what you describe as selfish utilitarianism. How did that happen? How did New Labour go off the rails?
What I try to do in the book, because I think you know this actually, because you follow some of these debates, Blair is very much seen as a pariah for much of his own party. He's seen as, despite the fact in the last 10 elections, we've only won 3, and all of them were won by Tony Blair. We fail to own our own victories, and we fail to understand our own defeats, because we are now so factionalized, and we fail to understand the potency of Blair, how powerful he was, but also why he declined. And I try and offer a different analysis, which says it's not an all or nothing thing about Blair, good or bad. It's really a question about how he changed as a politician, which is a story that's never really been told. Now, I was quite fortunate. I was quite close to him for many years. Less close, it should be added, in the latter years. But I was with him in the very early days, and he had this he could reconcile what I would call economistic and ethical elements across the left. And he did it in this brilliant way. And that's always been the fault line within the history of the UK left, has been the economistic and the sort of moral or the ethical traditions. He blended it together. He knew exactly what he was doing, by the way, as well. And he used spiritual resources that had available to him, his moral or ethical reading of both scripture and politics, to blend a really powerful politics that connected with people in the mid-90s and right through to the mid-2000s. Even after the Iraq War, he still won an election. But the real story is the changing within it, especially in the second term, where he moved towards a more transactional, utilitarian politics of what worked, rather than some of the moral or ethical forces that drove him as an earlier politician. In his biography, he skates over all of this. It's a very functional biography in that he sort of neglects all of the elements that made him such a compelling political figure, actually. It's a really interesting exercise of making sure the waters cover you over almost as a policy. He almost hides his early powerful political persona. It's almost too painful for him, I would interpret it. And maybe that's being over psychological in terms of my assessment of it. But it's a really interesting story that's not really told. So I try and separate it out by looking at this gradual transition of a political persona towards more of a utilitarian, tactical, managerial figure, less as a powerful, emotional character, and I think he would argue he was better by the end, right? He learned how to do the job. I would say he lost something that was really important in terms of his overall political character in that journey. And he actually calls his biography a journey, which I think is quite an interesting thing, because he forgets the departure point in this journey, and he covers it over. And I was quite keen to just remember what a fantastic politician he is and was, because now in Labour, we have this zero-sum view of him, which lacks nuance and complexity. So therefore, we can't own our own history, right? And so therefore, we cannot excavate what was so powerful within that New Labour story. And I think that is unless we do that, unless we can own our own recent history, I don't think we're going to be able to win again.
Yeah, I would have thought of you as being more from the left tradition in the party than Blair. but sharing with him that love of ethics and the love of history as well. But yes, the worst of New Labour for me is embodied in Philip Gould's Unfinished Revolution, which has all these sort of ad man to discussions of Mondeo man and the kind of the triangulation of voters that seems completely removed from any sense of ethics and values and the history of the party. You've made your.
There's an interesting point here as well, Andrew. There's an interesting parallel with the ALP, because I was always interested in Keating as a complex political figure, and his ethical anchorage is a really interesting story as well. That is often he told it quite well actually, but that's in terms of how do you understand these rounded, very powerful political complexities, like Blair and Keating, because we tend not to fully comprehend the complexity of them. And in so doing, we diminish ourselves as a Labour project, actually, by failing to own the richness of these characters.
Yeah, I mean, I've known half a dozen Australian prime ministers, but Keating has a level of complexity that is just off the charts from anyone else. I mean, he's
Right.
he is sui generis.
Right.
Let me move now from your critique of Blair to Blair's critique of the Labor Party. He had a piece the other day in the New Statesman in which he said the radical progressives aren't sensible and the sensible aren't radical. And he says today's politics has an old-fashioned economic message of big state tax and spend, which isn't particularly attractive and the right can do anyway, combined with a new-fashioned social cultural message around extreme identity and anti-police politics, which for large swathes of people is voter repellent. And he also makes the argument that the right evinces a pride in their nation, while parts of the left seem embarrassed by the very notion. How much of Blair's critique do you agree with? What do you disagree with?
Well, my departure point is always to inspect it quite systematically, what he's saying, because it's always worth listening to. I mean, the interesting thing about Tony Blair, he's had sounds terribly instrumental view, he's had a very good pandemic. He's been really on the front line, pushing public policy innovatively in terms of how we can create vaccines, antidotes, what the public messages should be, the public health stories. He's been really on the front line in terms of the public debate in the UK and actually internationally. So there is a sort of rehabilitation occurring. This intervention is a very powerful one, as you would always expect with Blair, brilliantly constructed. It's a very well put together series of arguments. I would say that what he tends to neglect, I mean, one of the criticisms I would have of what Tony does is it is still too much around the cross currents of the 90s politics rather than more contemporary feel to it. If we were creating new Labour today, it'd be very different to what we did in the mid-90s, right? But I think still it is a bit too much situated in time for him. And I don't think for example, in the quote you just made, I think there is a much greater case now for a much more muscular series of state interventions that he would accept in terms of public policy, like around work politics or anti-poverty strategies or inequality agendas. I think there is a greater case for state regulation across certain sectors, even ownership that he would not countenance around some sectors. I think there is a much greater need for a radical realignment of our constitutional settlements here that he would ever envisage, even though he did start well with London and Scotland and devolution. There's a much greater agenda in the UK now towards a more federal arrangement that you would find familiar in Australia. That is much more necessary. So on a whole series of fronts, there's a need for a greater creative state, something that I don't think he would accept, nor I think would he accept some of the tax justice measures that I think would be the hallmark of a modern New Labour agenda, which I don't think he would go towards. So I think now, and you can see this in Biden, because Biden's agenda in terms of his stimulus packages, what he's looking to in terms of his jobs packages, they're very different to a Clinton era, even an Obama era. Actually, you could argue that Biden is becoming a much more, what we would usually call more left-wing interventionist public politician than either of his two Democratic predecessors. And I think that goes with the time. He's a greater reader of the moment than arguably than Tony is. And I think Tony Blair is probably investing too much, again, on technology as a route out rather than politics and the contested spaces around work and poverty and inequality. So on a number of fronts, it's a sort of, I really welcome always his interventions. We have to rehabilitate his role and contribution in and around Labour without accepting hook, line and sinker all of the arguments, because I think it's underwhelming in terms of some of the statecraft necessary to deal with some of the challenges we face today.
Yeah, I thought it was a better diagnosis of the problem than set of proposed solutions. But you talked about Biden, which I think is fascinating, because Biden, in picking up some of that energy of the FDR New Deal, really is focusing quite squarely on what you're talking about, John, announcing an infrastructure package and trumpeting the fact that it will create a lot of jobs that don't require a college degree. That's quite different from another focus which Labor parties have taken in the past, where I think it's Blair in one of his speeches says, "What's the answer to these sorts of disruptive forces?" 3 answers: education, education, education. Right. But Biden's not taking that approach. He's saying, "You've got the skills you've got, and I'm going to give you the jobs that you need."
And you see, I was getting slightly melancholic finishing this book, because I was thinking, how do we weave together these different parts of a progressive coalition as we've lost again and we were plummeting in the polls? We got Boris Johnson, who is an extraordinary political figure, and we're seeing a dramatic reconstitution of class forces on the right, actually, of politics in the UK. And I was becoming quite despondent about the ability of us to weave together a coalition across our new middle class and our traditional base. And then along comes Biden, a sort of older, centrist, gaffe-prone guy who's been the insider for, the Beltway politician for so long. And he is weaving together this bold, imaginative path where he's talking about 18 million jobs you can raise a family on, which I thought was a really interesting phase, unionized jobs. He's talking about major stimulus.
Most private union president in decades.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that FDR element, I'm really interested in the FDR element, not just from the 30s, though, because in the 40s, in his State of the Union speech of 44, he started talking about new constitutional, economic and social rights: the right to work, the right to be housed, the right to education, health, the right to security. And I think there's a rich seam there for a left politics today, a progressive politics that can weave together what in America would be the liberal East and West Coast and the Rust Belt. In the UK, it would be our red wall and our, university or urban centres. There's an equivalent in Australia between the urban environments, university areas, and some of the more traditional country and sort of suburban. There is an agenda there. It's almost hiding in plain sight now with Biden, And the question is, have we in the UK the wherewithal to try and out-trump some of our binary traps that we're living in? We're in these traps at the moment. Can we transcend them? Can we get out from under? And I find the Biden story a compelling one, actually, a really compelling one. And I can see a route for us and Keir Starmer, our leader here, to think through new forms of citizenship about new economic and social rights for all of our fellow citizens, which could inspire across all parts of the country and reunite in terms of age, education, geography, leave, remain in terms of Brexit. Because there's almost like a canyon down the country now in terms of these big divisions, and a lot in my party are saying, well, we'll just choose one side of the pitch now. We'll just double down on the Remain side. They literally say our party lives in Romania, referring to the Brexit vote, and we should be the party of those with degrees, the educated, the young, as we've talked about before. And that is a very big bet. It's a very big bet for the future of the party. And I really like and find it quite inspiring the Biden plan and the strategy, which is pulling together and retaining a coalition of progressive and traditional forces.
Yeah, and the Romania strategy seems particularly dubious given what's happened in Scotland and the north of England. But I wanted to ask you, Biden's doing that off the back of Trump being unable to pass an infrastructure package. Both our parties are up against Conservatives that have moved a long way from their traditional small government roots. Both Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison have actively jettisoned the idea of surplus budgeting. They're willing to run large deficits to spend a lot. Does the sort of strategy you're advocating become more difficult outside the United States?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. It is very difficult because there is a sense that we are being crowded out a bit here because of our, I don't know what the Morrison thing. I was going to ask you about this actually, about how you handle the Morrison thing, because the Johnson challenge for us is quite difficult because part of our party wants to say same old Tories. You know, you can't trust the Tories, Tory sleaze. They've always been the same, you know, the party of Margaret Thatcher, et cetera, et cetera. Well, palpably, they're not the party of Margaret Thatcher. They are believers in the big state. They are trying to prioritise a totally different part of the landscape, geographical landscape to Margaret Thatcher. There's a much greater focus on working class, what you would call battlers, I suppose, in the old days. That's some of the constituency that Boris Johnson's really targeting very effectively. This is a very different party to the one I grew up fighting, you know, and the danger is in our own righteousness, if we want, you know, we ignore these changes that are occurring that create a much more difficult challenge. I would say, though, going back to this question of work, the one area where I don't think Boris Johnson's party will go is a real, genuine politics of rewarding work because of the hangover of Margaret Thatcher. Her whole strategy was based on extraordinary deregulation of labour. And I think that would be the one no-go area. I mean, Theresa May, she set up a review of modern working practices called the Taylor Review and wouldn't accept any of its relatively mild conclusions. The party wouldn't let her. She played around with the idea of industrial democracy, putting workers on boards to try and bolt the working class into a sort of stakeholding model of industry, if you want. The party wouldn't let her. I don't think the party would let Johnson go where I think some of their best thinkers know they have to go, which was to really create a blue-collar conservatism for the future. And that has to be built around some of the things we've talked about. Union recognition, you know, rights for workers, their contractual status in law, you know, some of these partnership working, good quality work. I don't think they'll be able to go there, which creates an opening for us. But if they were to go there, then it would make it much more difficult for us in the future.
It's also challenging too, given the collapse in the union base and more of an issue in Australia than in the UK, right? So you go to around 1980, both of our countries have about half the workforce in a union. But today you're at about a quarter.
Yeah, 23%. Yeah.
Yeah, we're close now to a tenth, right? We're not far off the United States level.
That's the same as America, yeah. Right.
Yeah, so that I suppose one of my questions is where you see the opportunities to grow the union movement and have unions play a bigger role in what you see as a central conversation for the Labor Party.
I didn't realise it was down to North American proportions in Australia.
It's a couple of percent above. I think wow. It might be a seventh or an eighth. But
right, because it is interesting that what is interesting to me is that Biden can make such a pro-union statements when he's on 10% and we're on 23%, and Labour doesn't do that in the UK. And it's quite interesting where he can feel liberated and strong enough to make these sorts of positions, whereas we can't yet. I think we need to, but I think we also need to incubate new forms of organisation. And this is a big challenge for the unions themselves, by the way, as well. The gig economy poses all sorts of challenges organisationally. There's some new unions that are emerging that are on the front line in terms of these battles. I'm more interested in how we can translate some of the organised terms and conditions in employment into unorganised sectors. And we have a few proposals around labour law that can do that in the UK, so that you can gain the benefits of unionism, the sort of exit voice arguments, in terms of having, without necessarily having to go through the whole union organisation recognition laws. There is also a case for new types of recognition. We introduced some in 98, 99 that didn't really work. So there is unfinished business there, but it is a big challenge, That's why I'm quite interested in a lot of the voice at work arguments rather than single channel union representation, in terms of trying to work through some of the industrial democracy avenues, co-determination in the UK, which might for workers, and that could challenge the traditional single track union routes to autonomous free collective bargaining to get your voice. So it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for the TUC. But there are some interesting pilots underway now that we might be able to learn from in the next couple of years. I'm not sure if it's the same over in the UK, Australia with the gig economy organisations, but there's some good pioneers now that are trying to chart some new direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So Unions New South Wales has done some good work with Airtasker. There's the Young Workers Centre, which is set up, organising, using online tools to organise pickets against sexual harassment at certain workplaces. There's unions that have focused on a Netflix model, pay $10 a month, so lowering the barriers to entry. There's a lot of really creative experimentation in the union movement, which I think is really positive for how it might play a part in the renewal of the left broadly defined. But this is, really bringing our parties back to being small L Labor parties, and making quite clear that they're not social democratic parties, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean,
they're more Labor than social democratic.
Well, and and I think, and that's where the sort of rubber hits the road a bit for me, because there are some fundamental character issues involved in the type of politics you're doing there. I quite like, this is where I quite like a politics that is rebuilt around questions of human dignity rather than identity. And that seems to me to be quite a useful way of rethinking some of the challenges ahead. And that rebuilds a sense of fraternity and solidarity in a politics, and also a sense of community. I know you've done a lot about rethinking the terms of community, and that seems to me to be the next bit I want to go on to after the question of labour, is the question of community in this sort of politics, and where we go. I just go back on the Netflix model of union membership. So really interesting. A few years ago, we tried with this idea of you pay a sort of your insurance ticket into a net pool of a federated model without a specific union or sector, and then it's redistributed from the TUC as some sort of insurance. We couldn't get the unions to go with that for certain protective reasons in terms of their own organisations, but there must be some model, because you have the technological wherewithal now to create some sort of insurance pool around a reimagined unionism for the future.
Yeah, and I know the Australian Council of Trade Unions has been looking at how to make membership more portable across unions, get rid of problems of demarcation dispute. You shouldn't have to figure out which is the right union for you. You should just be able to just say, I want to join the union, and someone else figure that out. And we'll get there. It's just taking a little while.
Right. But that is you could see the future there in terms of some sort of passporting through your portfolio of work, and
But tying together a lot of what we've talked about tonight, Jon, really is that your love of history and of the importance of the histories of our movements and the histories of our countries, where you talk about the importance of the nation. It's very much in the notion that we need to, as progressives, not be about blowing the system up and starting again, but about a love of country and a love of tradition, and providing voters with a sense of continuity. And for me, that was what was best out of Blue Labor. There are elements of Blue Labor which seem to play footsie with intolerant anti-immigration forces, but the best of it was which were the part that was grounded in traditions. And I loved your. You had a lovely section in a speech where you talked about the solution to the pauper's grave. Finish off by telling us the story of how a past Labor government dealt with the indignity that once someone died, they would be thrown in a common hole with everyone who died that day.
Well, actually, this goes right back to how we started this, because I remember on an Australian construction site, I was thrown a copy of The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist from an old Scottish Union guy who told me to read it. And I was just a guy trying to make some money, to have a good time, and it was quite an education. But Robert Noonan, who wrote The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, was Irish Liverpudlian, who died in a pauper and was buried in a pauper's grave in Walton Cemetery in Liverpool. And it was the height of the dispossessions or the indignities of the Industrial Revolution, that there was no dignity in death, not just in life. And his body was subsequently reclaimed. And it was literally the early cooperative funeral services that sought to reclaim the dignity of the human being at their moment of death through abolishing the pauper's death, where they were just all tossed into the same bit of land. And so it was that sense of people coming together through a sense of fraternity and duty and obligation to one another to contest the dispossessions of capitalism at the time, that you sought to reclaim the dignity of the person at their moment of transition out of this world. And there's such a powerful story about politics in that, in the sense of community, human dignity, of one of the writers of the
and ultimately a government payment was instituted, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And there was a really interesting
burial payment, was it?
There's a burial payment, and there was in the post-war period in the great Attlee government. It went through, it was further consolidated in the Attlee piece of legislation in the late 40s, but he deliberately took over the passage of this bill through Parliament. As Prime Minister, there's no need for him to do that because of his emotional connection to this story of the retrieval of the dignity of the person at the moment of death. Attlee is often seen as this, like cardboard, wooden managerial figure, but there were deep emotional currents within the man revealed quietly at that moment. So the notion of the pauper's death, it's a really powerful story of, there was someone wants to say, Labour traditions. Tradition is the democracy of the dead. You use tradition. You should not forget your traditions, because if you do that, you disrespect the memories of those who went before. And we are bearers of traditions. I take your point about the Blue Labour thing. The idea at the time was so that we'd remember our history and purpose. And then it span out into different illiberal avenues at times, which were unfortunate. But at its heart was an attempt to remember that sort of continuity in a Labour politics that you just carry. You are, your role is to sort of bear it and carry it on to others, and so that story of the death of Robert Noonan is a great story about the indignities of the modern world and the need for political action to contest it.
And in the end, you and I are team players. We will be with our teams till the very, very end. We grew up in Labor. We love the Labor Party, and the passion is to see it into government where it can do the most good. Jon Cruddas, thanks so much for taking the time to share your wisdom, to talk about your fascinating book, and to think about some of the challenges and the opportunities that the left faces in Britain and Australia and around the world.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Lovely to see you again, and it's great to talk, and I hope to literally be with you again soon. As we say, we're both Labour Party people through thin and thin, and on we go.
Terrific to chat, John. Thank you.